To be a
the
naturalist, got to
positions
believe in
that
these
they
things.
adopt undermine their own philosophy of naturalism. Alvin Plantinga has developed a celebrated argument called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And what this really is an evolutionary argument against physicalism or against materialism. Because if there is no immaterial self or soul, then our beliefs are irrelevant to our evolutionary success. Evolution does not select for the truth of beliefs, it selects for behavior. And therefore, as long as we behave or act in certain ways, we will survive and flourish regardless of what we believe.
Hello and welcome to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together about 60,000 Christian doctors and dentists from over 100 affiliated movements worldwide. And today we've got the second of two interviews that we're running in conjunction with the Forum of Christian Leaders. And we're delighted to have the leading philosopher and theologian, William Lane Craig, with us. So we have today the great opportunity to speak with William Lane Craig about his calling as a Christian philosopher and theologian. Dr. Craig is going to share lessons learned from his experiences and also offer advice for Christian academics about how to be faithful in their callings. William Lane Craig is well known, I think, to many of the people here. He is Emeritus Research Professor of Philosophy at Talbot School of Theology in La Mirada in California. And he pursued his undergraduate studies at Wheaton College, where he did a BA back in 1971, and graduate studies at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, where he did 2 MAs. And then the University of Birmingham for a PhD in 1977, and the University of Munich for his DPhil in 1984. He's a distinguished theologian and philosopher. He's authored or edited more than 60 books, including the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology, as well as over 300 articles and professional publications of philosophy and theology. In 2006, Dr. Craig became the founder and the president of Reasonable Faith. And in 2016, he was named by the Best Schools as one of the 50 most influential living philosophers. So quite an introduction. Dr. Craig, it's such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for giving your time to this program. And we really look forward to hearing you and engaging with you in Q&A.
It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. Well, I want to start way back. And looking back at your early years, can you tell us what first awakened your interest in philosophy and theology back then?
I was what you would call a late bloomer. My freshman year in college, I took an intro to philosophy course, but I'm sorry to say that my professor did me a very great disservice in that class. He taught the course simply by going through one historical figure after another, saying what they believed, but without ever giving any sort of evaluation of their views. Moreover, he never addressed why this subject matter was important for my Christian faith. And so I was rather disaffected by the whole discipline until my senior year at Wheaton, when I took a class called Conflicts in Biblical Christianity. And in connection with that class, I read the book by Edward John Carnell called Introduction to Christian Apologetics. And this book opened my eyes. Carnell was asking questions like, what is truth? How do we test for truth? Is Christianity true? And I thought, these are really the questions that I'm interested in. And just before graduating from Wheaton, I picked up on a clearance table on the college bookstore this book by Stuart Hackett entitled The Resurrection of Theism. During my years at Wheaton, my theology professors had taught me that there are no good arguments for the existence of God, that they'd all been refuted. And while that didn't seem right to me, I thought, well, these esteemed professors must know far more about it than I do. Who am I to disagree? But then reading Hackett's book, I found him offering arguments for God's existence and refuting every conceivable objection that might be brought against them. And it was at that point I thought, I have got to settle my mind with respect to these arguments. If I am ever able to pursue further graduate studies, I'm going to do so in philosophy, and I'm going to work on these arguments for God's existence. And so that was what awakened my interest in philosophy and theology.
Well, that's really amazing, and that happened at Wheaton too. One would be perhaps surprised by that, but thank the Lord for those encounters that you had. You've published over 60 books and 300 articles. What writing project, looking back, was the most personally significant for you, and why? There's so many, of course, but what was most personally significant?
I think that probably my book, Atonement and the Death of Christ, is the most personally significant to me. The atonement lies at the very heart of the Christian faith, in the doctrine of salvation and Christology. And so a robust defense of a biblical theory of the atonement, I think, is absolutely vital to the flourishing of the Christian faith. And therefore, I think perhaps the most theologically significant work that I have written would be this book, Atonement and the Death of Christ.
Mm. Well, thank you so much. What drove you to found Reasonable Faith back in 2006? And what particular need did you see in the church or academy at that time that you wanted to address?
By that time, I had been involved in about 25 years of evangelistic speaking on secular university campuses in North America and Europe. But I was dissatisfied with the impact of these events. It seemed like, despite my best efforts, they were all done in a corner, and that there was not the broad cultural impact of these events that I wanted to have. And so we decided to start a web-based ministry called Reasonable Faith that would feature my work on the internet and make it widely acceptable for free to anyone who would care to access it. And it was intended to be a sort of megaphone to the ministry that I already was having, to disseminate this material as widely as possible, and so to have a cultural impact as broadly as we could.
And how has doing that changed your ministry or the scope of it?
Oh, it's unbelievable, Peter. As I say, when I was speaking in the pre-reasonable faith days on university campuses, we would draw good crowds, 2,000, 3,000 students, but it didn't go beyond that. But now, with the video revolution and the YouTube channels and the access to this material through social media, we are reaching millions of people. My debate with Christopher Hitchens at Biola University has been viewed by literally millions of people since it occurred. And according to the analytics, the most recent analytics for our website and ministry that I've seen is that across our social media platforms, we have had 8 million engagements per month. Now, these are not just clicks. To be an engagement, you've got to actually do something like read an article, view a video, like something. And we've had 8 million per month across our social media platforms. So the impact of reasonable faith has been a dream come true for me.
Do you have data about the global impact? Is it reaching a worldwide audience?
Yes, yes, it's amazing how in Muslim countries, in other closed countries, people are accessing this. And we are founding local reasonable faith chapters
Mhm.
around the world in addition to these digital outreaches. We want to empower local leaders to have a ministry of their own. And we have especially strong interest in Latin America, in Spanish speaking and Portuguese speaking countries. But these chapters are all over the world, even in places like Nepal and Pakistan.
Mm.
There are reasonable faith chapters that are meeting locally and teaching this material to Christian disciples and reaching out in evangelism in their local communities.
And are all these groups engaging with the same kind of questions, or is it different in different parts of the
Well,
world,
the
different worldviews?
primary aim here is that they would use my material. So there is a strong focus on arguments for the existence of God and evidences for Jesus, and particularly the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
So we make sure that all of these local leaders are trained and qualified in those areas. Now, certainly some of them have additional interests, for example, creation and science, or maybe sexual ethics, things of that sort. But our real bread and butter will be based upon our material in a book like Reasonable Faith.
Yeah. Mm. Now, you've talked about you've mentioned already your debate with Chris Hitchens, which has aroused a huge amount of interest. And of course, you've engaged in lots of public debates. How have these debates shaped you personally? I mean, not just intellectually, but actually personally as well, because it's a real spiritual battlefield, isn't it?
I suppose that the way they've impacted me personally would be that they've enabled me to really keep my cool when
Mm.
under attack. It is so important in these events that one display the character of Christ,
Mm.
Christian charity and goodwill, and not become defensive or angry or lash out at one's opponent. You can let the opponent do that sort of thing, but I
Mhm.
want to be a Christian gentleman in these debates.
And just to go a bit deeper on that, how do you keep your composure when perhaps an atheist or agnostic conversation partner becomes really aggressive towards you and towards the gospel? Christ.
Yes, well, I keep in mind the admonition of Jesus. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you for my sake. For your reward is great in heaven. And so when they do that, I just thank them silently in my mind for giving me another award in heaven.
So you're taking it as a real encouragement as well, I guess. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's great. Now, being named one of the 50 most influential living philosophers is quite an honor. What did that recognition mean for you personally? Because I'm assuming this is all philosophers. It's not just Christian philosophers.
Oh, that's correct. There were about two or three Christians on that list.
Wow.
Um, and it was very gratifying for me because it meant that my work was having a palpable impact on
Yeah.
the field, such as I desired to have. Notice that it was not a list of the 50 greatest philosophers living today, but the 50 most influential
Yes.
living
Yeah.
philosophers. And so this was a measure of the impact that my work was now having. And so that was very gratifying.
Yeah. what do you see as your biggest contribution to the fields of philosophy and religion and Christian apologetics? So you've talked already about the book on the atonement, but in terms of the contribution you've made to philosophical debates, what would you put your finger on?
I think probably my revival of the Kalam cosmological argument,
Yeah.
and then the ensuing resurrection of interest in natural theology.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at Christian apologetics over the last half century or so, it mainly consisted of giving Christian evidences for the Bible or the Gospels,
Yeah.
but was very weak in terms of arguments for the existence of God. And things are quite different today. And I think that my work has helped to incite that resurgence of interest in natural theology.
Mm-hmm.
In addition to that, I would cite my work on the coherence of theism, particularly the divine attributes of eternity and aseity. I think those works make a substantive contribution to the field.
Really? No, thank you. Now, you mentioned early on about the two books you read by Edward John Carnell and Stuart C. Hackett, which got you into theology and apologetics very early on. But which of your mentors or professors that you've met in the various university contexts you've been in had the most profound impact on your own intellectual development, and why?
Mm-hmm.
And
I have to say,
there could be bad examples or good examples, I guess. People
yes.
who made you determined to counter their thinking, and others who really encouraged you.
I understand the intent of the question, but I would say that the person who has had the most profound impact on my intellectual development has been neither one of my professors or personal mentors. It would be Alvin Plantinga.
Okay.
Alvin Plantinga is a giant in the field of philosophy. I think he's comparable to another Leibniz. And I count it such a tremendous privilege to have been alive and working during the time that Alvin Plantinga has been active in Christian philosophy. And so I think probably by far it would be Al Plantinga who has had the most impact on me.
Did you have a lot of personal interaction with him, or was it largely
Yes,
through books?
yes, we've become friends with him
Yeah.
and his wife Catherine, and have collaborated on various projects together. So that has been a wonderful experience to get to know him personally.
Great. Now, you spent decades teaching at Talbot School of Theology. You're emeritus professor now. But what do you hope, looking back, that your students might remember most about their time with you?
Good. I hope that it would be a devotion to excellence, to doing first rate work that competes with secular scholarship on a level playing field in terms of the same standards of scholarship. I would hope that that commitment to excellence would be something that they would remember.
Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, you've been a very productive academic with your books and articles, but you also, unlike many academics, perhaps, have also had a very active public-facing ministry over the years. How have you managed to balance the two, being both an academic and someone who's willing and able to engage in the public square as well?
I was very determined when I began to do public university speaking that I would not do so at the expense of my scholarly career and work. Many Christians who are actively involved in ministry never do a better work than their doctoral dissertation. That represents the peak of their academic work, and I did not want to be one of them. So what I tried to do was to limit the popular speaking in such a way that I would be able to pursue my own scholarly academic work, and that has worked out beautifully. And founding Reasonable Faith has really augmented that because I've been able to turn over the nuts and bolts of running Reasonable Faith to our executive director, Michael Lapine. And he lifts that burden off my shoulders so
Mhm.
that I can devote myself to study and writing while he directs the ministry.
Yeah. If you were to talk about the relative importance of your writing on the one hand and your speaking on
Hmm.
the other, how would you characterize that? Which has been more important, if any? How do you balance those two things? Especially, I think, in the kind of world we're living in now, where social media and the internet is so active and so much debate happens live or online.
Yes. Initially, I felt very torn between the two. I once remarked to my wife, Jan, that when I'm traveling and speaking on university campuses, I wish I could be in my study, reading and writing. But when I'm in my study reading and writing, I feel that urge to be out on the university campus speaking and debating. And so there was a real tension between those two. Since COVID hit, it prevented my traveling and speaking. So for the last 5 years, that traveling and speaking ministry has largely been put on hold. And I have devoted myself instead to writing a multi volume systematic philosophical theology, which is sort of the crowning work of my academic career. And so the balance has definitely shifted now in favor of this scholarly pursuit. It is a sort of magnificent obsession for me, and I want to finish this systematic philosophical theology.
Well, that's fantastic. When can you make any predictions about when that might come out, or do people
It
will?
is appearing volume by volume.
Okay.
The initial volume, which is prolegomena on scripture and on faith, that appeared last year.
Mhm.
Later last year, volume 2A came out,
Mhm.
which is on the doctrine of God, particularly the attributes of God. Now, volume 2B, which is an excursus in natural theology and the doctrine of the Trinity, will hopefully appear later this year. It is completely done. It's gone through production. All that it needs now is an index to be
Yeah.
added to the rear of it, and then that will be out. The other volumes are in production, they're in work. I am currently writing the final fifth volume, and I hope to be done with my writing by the end of this year.
Okay. So we hope that most of them will have appeared within a year or two.
Well, it's very slow. I
Yeah.
would say within 2 or 3 years.
Okay. Brilliant. Now, looking at the cultural and philosophical landscape today, what challenges and opportunities for Christian philosophy do you think are the most urgent? What do we need to be really seriously engaging with?
That's a difficult question to answer. I would say that I think sexual ethics
Mhm.
would be a real priority for Christian philosophers who are doing ethics. Certainly, Christian sexual ethics are widely rejected in our culture under severe attack. And so I hope that our ethicists will be addressing those questions. And then I think philosophy of mind
Yeah.
will continue to be uh, an important discipline because the exploration of the human brain, of neurology, the brain sciences, is really the final frontier and raises deep questions about the existence of the soul, free will, and determinism, and the relationship between soul and body. So I hope that philosophers will continue to address the philosophy of mind as a central concern.
Okay. We'll come back to that question a little bit later because I want to explore that a bit more with you, that second question. But first, I just wanted to ask, when you reflect back on your career, what moments stand out for you as turning points? You talked about your time at Wheaton and the reading
Yes.
of those two books, but were there any other moments that really changed the trajectory of your ministry? And I guess at a deeper level, we're asking, how do you think God led and guided you to where you are today? Yeah.
Well, I think, first of all, going to Trinity Evangelical Divinity School to pursue a Master of Arts in Philosophy of Religion under the program directed by Norman Geisler was a stepping stone for me to then doctoral work in philosophy. And then going to Europe to pursue doctoral studies at Birmingham and then later in Munich was certainly pivotal because the work done there laid the foundations philosophically for the rest of my career in providing an apologetic for the Christian faith. And then I've already mentioned later in 2006, the founding of our web-based ministry, Reasonable Faith, was certainly a turning point.
No. Now, you've talked about some of the books that have influenced you, Carnell and Hackett. You've talked about Alvin Plantinga. You've mentioned Norman Geisler as well just now. But would there be any, for people starting out in this whole era, I'm thinking of, first of all, of the interface between philosophy and theology, what sort of books would you be recommending that people read? And not just for those who are pursuing this at university, but just the ordinary thinking Christian in the pew. A lot of our listeners here are doctors and dentists who are not engaged formally in Christian ministry. But what sort of authors and books would you point to?
Well, let me mention a couple of things that were really inspirational for me in my career. First would be John Wesley's Address to the Clergy. This is a remarkable speech that Wesley gave to Methodist ministers about the qualities that they should acquire to be as effective as they could in Christian ministry. And Wesley's vision of a Christian minister is really breathtaking and convicting. And I found it tremendously challenging and inspirational. Then also I would mention Charles Malick's essay, The Two Tasks. Malick was a Lebanese ambassador to the United Nations and a Christian. And he emphasized that in contemporary culture, we face two tasks. One is winning the heart, and the other is winning the mind. And he emphasized that as Christians, we're lagging behind in our task of winning the mind. We need to retake lost ground at the secular university. And so Malick's work was a great challenge to me. And then finally, Alvin Plantinga has an essay that he published that has been a kind of manifesto, if you will, for contemporary Christian philosophy called Advice to Christian Philosophers. And I would recommend someone to read that to understand the importance of integrating one's Christian faith with one's discipline, whatever it might be.
Well, thank you. And what about for academics, so young scholars trying to integrate their faith with their academic work? What sort of perhaps higher level resources would you recommend?
Well, those are the ones that I had in mind. I think that young scholars need to read those first to have a vision of the task to which God is calling them. And then beyond that, if you want to understand something about philosophy, my discipline, and the Christian faith, look at the book I did with J.P. Moreland entitled Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. That would be a great book to introduce someone to philosophy and the Christian faith.
So
Let's come back to the question of the philosophy of mind again, which you've mentioned, and I guess the mysteries and puzzles of things like, particularly the problem of consciousness, self-awareness, conscience, these sorts of issues. How can you use the hard problem of consciousness as an argument for the existence of, well, I guess as you mentioned already, the existence of the soul, but beyond that, to the existence of God? How useful is it?
I myself have not specialized in philosophy of mind. So I haven't used this really as an argument for the existence of God, but I do see this as a vital area of philosophy that others need to pursue. It's just not my area of specialization. Where it was relevant to my work was that many of the arguments against the soul also apply against the existence of God. Because when you think about it, God just is an immaterial, intellectual substance or soul. And therefore, if souls cannot exist, God cannot exist. And so in my volume that I mentioned of my systematic philosophical theology on the attributes of God, one of the attributes is incorporeality, that God is an immaterial being. And there I found responding to these arguments in philosophy of mind was really important in providing a defense of God's existence and incorporeality. More broadly, if one wanted to make this into an argument for God's existence, an argument of natural theology, I think that what one would argue is that a world with immaterial souls in it, in other words, anthropological dualism, fits much better in a worldview in which there is a transcendent mind or soul which has created the universe, rather than a naturalistic worldview of matter in motion. And so the reality of the soul would, I think, provide confirmatory support for a worldview of theism.
To what extent are people who are naturalists, philosophically, to what extent are they shooting themselves in the foot over issues like free will, conscience, consciousness, self-awareness?
The positions that they adopt undermine their own philosophy of naturalism. Alvin Plantinga has developed a celebrated argument called the evolutionary argument against naturalism. And what this really is an evolutionary argument against physicalism or against materialism. Because if there is no immaterial self or soul, then our beliefs are irrelevant to our evolutionary success. Evolution does not select for the truth of beliefs, it selects for behavior. And therefore, as long as we behave or act in certain ways, we will survive and flourish regardless of what we believe. And so naturalism, or physicalism more correctly, undermines our confidence in the reliability of our cognitive faculties. And since naturalism is itself the product of our cognitive faculties, it turns out to be a self-defeating position. One cannot have confidence then that naturalism is true, because if it is true, our cognitive faculties cannot be trusted to deliver reliably true beliefs. So I do think naturalists are shooting themselves in the foot. If I were a naturalist or a material, well, not a materialist, I were a naturalist. I didn't believe in God. I still wouldn't be a materialist. I would be an anthropological dualist who
Yeah,
affirms the reality of the soul or mind in addition to the body,
yeah,
even if you were not a theist.
yeah, yeah. Fascinating. Now, you talked earlier about the importance of winning both the heart and the mind. If we can just look at those two in turn. First of all, what are the best intellectual arguments, do you think, in your experience, in winning people to Christ, or perhaps initially getting them to engage seriously with theism?
Yeah. Well, my favorite argument is not necessarily the most effective argument. My favorite argument is the Kalam cosmological argument based on the beginning of the universe. But this argument doesn't really touch people where they live. You can get along very well in life without ever thinking about the question of the finitude of the past or where the universe came from. Rather, I think the most effective argument for God's existence is the moral argument,
Yeah.
which holds that God is the best explanation for the objectivity of moral values and moral duties that
Mm.
we apprehend in moral experience. And this argument, I think, is unavoidable. Every day you wake up, you answer by how you treat other people, whether you believe in the objectivity of moral values and duties. Are people simply things to be used for your own ends? Or
Mm.
are people intrinsically valuable? Are they ends in themselves and
Mm.
therefore to be treated as such? And that question, I think, is unavoidable for us and forms the basis then for saying that in the absence of God, there is no basis in naturalism for the objectivity of moral values and duties.
Very Yeah, absolutely. I wonder, can you just summarize for us the Kalam cosmological argument, if you were asked to do it briefly for a lay
Yes,
audience?
very.
How would you summarize it?
Yes, it can be summarized in three simple steps. Number one, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Things don't just pop into being out of nothing. Number two, the universe began to exist. And here one will bring philosophical arguments against the infinitude of the past, as well as contemporary scientific evidence for the beginning of the universe. And that then leads logically to the conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. And you can then do a conceptual analysis of what it means to be a cause of the universe. And you can infer as a result that there is a first, uncaused, beginningless, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, enormously powerful, personal creator of the universe. So that, in a nutshell, is the argument.
Yeah, beautiful. Let's go to the issues of the heart now. And just a reminder to people, you can put questions in live to this interview by using the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. You'll see other people have typed in questions. You can upvote other people's questions there as well. But I want to go to one of those questions from Benjamin Chang, who was speaking on the webinars just before Christmas on another issue. And Ben's getting back to this issue of the heart. He says, in the last few years, we've seen the rise of a post-truth culture in the West, particularly amongst young people. It seems that people no longer universally submit to the authority of logic, evidence, or science, and instead place a greater weight to personal conviction and lived experience. Do you think traditional logic and evidence-based apologetics, which you've been a very inspiring leader in, is still effective? Or do you think apologetics needs to adapt to our post-truth culture? And if so, how?
I think that the tools of logic and rationality are as effective as ever. And the reason is because we do not live in a post truth, postmodern culture. The idea that we live in a postmodern culture in the West is a myth that is perpetrated in our churches by misguided youth pastors. The fact is that Western culture remains deeply modernist in its assumptions. Science and technology are relied upon to give us the truth about reality. The culture is not relativistic about science, technology, and medicine. What they are relativistic about is ethics
Yes,
and religion.
yes.
You see, that's not postmodernism. That's old line modernism, that science gives us the truth about reality, and matters of religion and ethics are simply subjective opinions of personal consciousness. So I think that the illusion that we live in a postmodern, post truth culture is one of the cleverest deceptions that Satan has tried to foist upon us to get us to lay down voluntarily our best weapons of logic and evidence in favor of just sharing our narrative, thinking that this is going to be effective in a postmodern culture. No, the culture in the West remains deeply modernist, and we must insist that Christianity is objectively true, in the same sense that science and technology give us truth.
You're And what's your experience as a public speaker, being someone in the public square, engaging on the internet and so on? Are you finding that there is a difference in the responses to the sort of arguments that you're famous for? Or is it really just the same as it has been, even back in the 1970s?
I'm really glad you asked that question. When I was traveling and speaking widely on university campuses, I kept waiting for these relativistic, postmodern, post-truth students to get up in the Q&A time and say your arguments are based upon outmoded canons of logic and rationality that no longer hold, et cetera, et cetera. This never happened. It never happened. As long as you approach the topic rationally and logically, my experience is that the students respond logically and rationally. Now, certainly they'll raise objections to what you say, but that's exactly what you want them to do. You want to engage them on the evidence using the standard canons of logic. So my experience, limited as it is, has been that these age-old questions remain, and that the sort of answers that I provide for them in my work, like Reasonable Faith, continue to be effective in addressing these deep questions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Now, someone's asked in the chat, what about the 80 questions that were submitted? So let me just reassure listeners that we are definitely working our way through those now, and also taking the questions that you've raised in the Q&A as well. So one of those 80 questions, William, was this: what's the most difficult question that you've ever been asked to respond to? And perhaps in two contexts, in the context of public debate, but also in written debate as well.
Yes. Yeah. My answer to this question is going to be, I think, probably surprising, but I think that the most difficult objection that I've ever encountered is the objection based upon the reality of abstract objects like numbers and other mathematical entities, which, according to a philosophy known as Platonism, are eternal, necessarily existent, and uncreated entities. I first encountered this objection at a conference in 1982 when the philosopher from University of Notre Dame, Thomas Morris, was talking about the challenge that these sorts of abstract objects posed to divine aseity or self existence. According to the Christian faith, God is the sole ultimate reality. He is the creator of everything that exists other than himself. But if Platonism is true, then God is just one of an infinite multitude of uncreated, necessarily existing objects. And Morris's own answer to this question was deeply unsatisfactory. It was clear he didn't have a good response. And I did not know how to answer this. It was like a dagger in the heart of theism. And I thought, I don't know how to deal with this. Well, I put the question on the back burner for many years while I was working on the subject of divine eternity. But when I finished that, I then finally turned to the question of divine aseity. And for the next 13 years, this subject occupied me as my full-time research project. And out of that came a pair of books. God and Abstract Objects is one, and the other one is called God Over All. And I was able to come to intellectual peace about the challenge of Platonism. So this is the most difficult objection that I, as a philosopher, have encountered, and it is tremendously intellectually satisfying to have come to an answer to this problem.
And how would you frame an answer to that problem now?
Mhm. It's so abstract and recondite, it's difficult to do it in a public debate. But the so-called indispensability argument for these abstract objects says that if we refer to such objects, or if we say, the language here is if we quantify over them in statements we believe to be true, then we are ontologically committed to these objects. So, for example, if I say the number of people killed in the airplane crash was 250, that commits me ontologically to the number 250 because I said that the number of people killed was 250. If I say something like this, there is a prime number between 2 and 4, then I've said there is something, and that commits me to the reality of the number 3. And so what I did was to challenge that criterion of ontological commitment that would oblige us to believe in such realities simply because we refer to them or quantify over them. I think that is a patently false criterion of ontological commitment. And so that's what I would attack. I would say that we can use terms irreverentially, that they don't really refer to objects in the world, and yet the statements are true. So socially constructed realities would be a great example. When I say Wednesday is between Tuesday and Thursday, that's true, but it doesn't commit me to the ontological reality of Wednesdays. Or if I say there are hindrances to the plan, I think that's true, but I don't believe for a second that there are things in the world called hindrances that actually exist. So I think that this criterion of ontological commitment, which is very widely assumed, is ontologically inflationary. It will lead to commitments to all sorts of fantastic realities like hindrances, differences, Wednesdays, hours before dawn, and things of that sort that very plausibly don't exist. And so I adopt a solution that's called neutralism, which says that the use of referential terms and logical quantification is neutral in its ontological commitments. Is that clear? I know this is so technical, but I've tried to explain it as best I can.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure it will encourage people to read more deeply on those books as well. Just to get back again to the challenges the church is facing today, what would you say is the greatest threat facing evangelicals in the 21st century? And
Wow.
is it different from what it was 20, 30 years ago, earlier in your ministry?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not really qualified to answer that question sociologically. What are the sociological challenges facing the church? Certainly, they are huge, but one that would be important would be that the church doesn't sufficiently value the life of the mind. I think that many people go to church just to get an emotional fix in a worship experience, and they're not really interested in the truth of Christian doctrine, in understanding it or defending it. And this predominance of emotional worship services in the church and the lack of intellectual engagement, I think, has led to the feminization of the evangelical church. The church has become very matriarchal. The women's ministries tend to be far stronger, far greater than the men's ministries in the church. And this will not attract young men to the church in the way that we need to do. We need to, I think, have a good emphasis on intellectual engagement and rationality that men find inherently appealing.
Mhm. And so just building on that, how can we motivate regular churchgoers to be thinking more deeply about their faith?
Yeah. I think that the mechanism of adult Sunday school classes is
Mhm.
ideal for this. We should not lay this responsibility on the pastor's shoulders. The pastor is overworked and overburdened already. Rather, this responsibility needs to be delegated to some layperson who has a burden for this and who can teach adult Sunday school classes on Christian doctrine, apologetics, church history, uh, biblical contents, maybe even New Testament Greek. Why not make that available to lay people? So I think we need to exploit the adult Sunday school classes to awaken Christians to the need for this material.
That's a fascinating challenge. I was a few years ago. I was in Washington and went to the Nine Marks Church in Capitol Hill, and
Hmm.
it began with adult Sunday school, and you
Ah,
had a choice of half a dozen seminars on subjects like those you just mentioned before the church began, and they were led, of course, not by the pastor but by people in the church with those
yes.
skills. And I thought, what a wonderful idea. And I've not really seen that operating in other places. We tend to go to Christian conferences to get that kind of input. But yes, wouldn't it be wonderful to see more of it in the local church?
Yes, and if we do empower key laymen in the church to do this, I think that the church might well sponsor him to go to such conferences for him to be refreshed and motivated in his own learning. So we can do things like that to uh, motivate this sort of ministry.
Mm. What's the most, uh, for you, what have you experienced as the number one temptation in terms of diverting you from your academic course? Because there
Oh,
must have been many naysayers along the way. Perhaps you had even doubts yourself. But what was the number one temptation that people need to watch out for?
well, I am very single minded in my calling. I understand my own calling. It's not easy to be diverted from it. I suppose what we talked about before is the temptation to become a popularizer and to, as a result, let one's academic work slide. There's a great ego massaging effect of being a public speaker, hearing people applaud for you, saying how wonderful you did, and so forth. This is very, very uh, bracing for the ego. And I think that one needs to be very careful about not letting that go to one's head, but to be humble, to realize that um, you're not all that your press says you are. Um, I think that would be one temptation to really watch out for.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, we've pretty much run out of time now, but I just wanted to ask you right at the end, another of the questions we've had submitted. How did you personally come to faith? I assume it was before you went to Wheaton, but just give us in a nutshell your own personal.
Yes. Well, I was not raised in a Christian family or even a church going home, though it was a good and loving family. But when I became a teenager, I began to ask what I call the big questions in life. Who am I? Why am I here? Where am I going? And in the search for answers, I began to attend a large church in our community. The only problem was, um, instead of answers, all I found was a sort of social country club where the dues were $1 a week in the offering plate. And the other high school students in the youth group who claimed to be Christians lived for their real God the rest of the week, which was popularity. And they would do anything in order to serve that God. And this really bothered me because I thought, I feel so spiritually empty inside, and yet externally, I'm leading a better life than they are. They must be just as empty as I am, but they're just putting up a false front to the world, pretending to be something than that. They're all just a pack of hypocrites. And soon this attitude spread toward the church in general, and I became very disaffected with the institutional church. And then this attitude spread toward people in general. I said, everybody is a phony. Everybody is holding up a plastic mask to the world, afraid to come out and be genuine. And so I grew very hateful toward other people. I said, I don't like people. I don't want anything to do with people. I threw myself into my studies. I was on my way, frankly, toward becoming a very alienated young man. And yet, at the same time, when I looked into my own heart, I sensed that deep down I really did want to love and to be loved by others. And I realized at that moment I was just as much a hypocrite as they were, because here I was putting on such a brave face, pretending not to need people, when deep down inside I knew that I really did. And so that anger turned in upon myself for my own phoniness and inauthenticity. And I don't know if you know what this is like, but this kind of inner anger just eats away at your insides day after day, making every day miserable, another day to get through. And I remember one day I was feeling particularly crummy, and I walked into my high school German class, and I sat down behind a girl who is one of these types that is always so happy, it just makes you sick. And I tapped her on the shoulder, and she turned around, and I said, Sandy, what are you always so happy about anyway? And she said, it's because I'm saved. And I said, you're what? And she said, I know Jesus Christ as my personal Savior. And I said, well, I go to church. And she said, that's not enough, Bill. You've got to have him really living in your heart. And I said, well, what would he want to do a thing like that for? And she said, because he loves you, Bill. And that just hit me like a ton of bricks. Here I was so filled with anger and hatred inside. and she said there was someone who really loved me. And that thought staggered me. It was the God of the universe, she said, who loved me. And I couldn't take it in. The idea that the God of the universe could love that worm, Bill Craig, down on that speck of dust called planet Earth. I just couldn't take it in. Well, I went home that night and I found a New Testament that had been given to me in the fifth grade by the Gideon Society. And for the first time, I opened it and began to read it. And as I did so, I was absolutely captivated by the person of Jesus of Nazareth. There was a wisdom about this man's teaching that I had never encountered before, and especially there was an authenticity about his life that was not characteristic of those people who claimed to be his followers in that local church I was attending. And I realized then I couldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Sandy introduced me to other Christians in the high school, and no matter what they said about Jesus, the thing I couldn't deny was that they seemed to be in contact with another plane of reality that I knew nothing about. And it imparted a deep meaning and peace and joy to their life that I craved. Well, to make a long story short, I went through about 6 months of the most intense soul searching that I'd ever been through in my life. I read the New Testament from cover to cover. I attended Christian meetings. I read Christian books. I prayed to God. And finally, at the end of those 6 months, on September 11th, 1965, I just came to the end of my rope and cried out to God. And as I did, I cried out all the bitterness and the anger that had been building inside of me. And I felt this tremendous infusion of joy, like a balloon being blown up and blown up until it was ready to burst. And I rushed outside, and I remember it was a warm Midwestern summer evening. And as I looked up at the sky, I could see the Milky Way from horizon to horizon. And as I looked up at the stars, I thought, God, I've come to know God. And that moment changed my whole life because I had thought enough about this message during those 6 months to realize that if Bill Craig ever became a Christian, I could do nothing less than devote my entire life to sharing this message among mankind. Because if this is the truth, if it's really the truth, then this is the greatest news ever announced. And so for me, my conversion was simultaneous with my call to vocational Christian ministry.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, and just puts in context everything that you've said up till now. And we're so grateful for your time, but also your witness and your example and your writing. And just want to encourage you to keep going for it, staying green in old age, and still very productive. It's so inspirational. So thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Peter.
For your time.